Can the Pope ban the traditional Latin Mass? Well, rumor has it Pope Francis is planning on doing exactly that for all priests outside of the former Ecclesia Dei societies. But these rumors have prompted a lot of speculation about whether or not the Pope really has this kind of power in the first place. So today, we're going to look at the Church's precedent, history, and teaching on what powers the Pope has to ban the traditional Latin Mass or not. For this question, the best place to start is with Innocent III, because in 1208, King John of England refused to accept Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury. In response to this, Pope Innocent III placed the Kingdom of England under interdict for 6 years until 1214. Well, what does that mean? It means that for 6 years in England, public masses were banned throughout the entire kingdom. In fact, the only sacraments that were permitted were baptism, confession, anointing of the sick, and marriage. And even then, confession was only permitted to be administered to the sick and the dying, and marriages could only take place outside the church building and without a nuptial mass. But did Pope Innocent really have the authority to do this? After all, it's kind of wild to think that the Pope could just ban the Mass throughout an entire country just because their king was being disobedient. Was Pope Innocent overstepping his authority? Maybe the Church has since condemned his actions. Well, as it turns out, the Church has actually consistently upheld the legitimacy of a papal interdict. In fact, Innocent III, though he's most famous for it, he's neither the first nor the last Pope to exercise this power. The interdict was also used by Pope Adrian IV in 1155, Pope John XXII in 1317, Pope Boniface VIII in 1303, Gregory XI in 1376, Pope Sixtus IV in 1478, Pope Julius II in 1510, Pope Paul V in 1606, and Pope Pius X in 1909. Now, I think that when considering the question of whether or not the Pope can actually ban the traditional Latin Mass, the interdict power really helps to illustrate the extent of the Pope's primacy of jurisdiction over the Church. Because if you're going to tell me that the Pope has the power to ban the Mass completely as a form of punishment in a given region, but can't restrict one liturgical form in particular for any reason, I think that's a bit of a stretch. But wait, what about Quo Primum? For those of you who don't know, Quo Primum is an apostolic constitution promulgated by Pius V in 1570, and it was the first promulgation of the unified standard Roman Missal. In it, Pius V says, quote, "Furthermore, by this law, in virtue of our apostolic authority, we grant and concede in perpetuity that, for the chanting or reading of the Mass in any church whatsoever, this Missal is hereafter to be followed absolutely, without any scruple of conscience or fear of incurring any penalty, judgment, or censure, and may freely and lawfully be used. Nor are superiors, administrators, canons, chaplains, and other secular priests or religious of whatever title designated obliged to celebrate the Mass otherwise than as enjoined by us. We likewise declare and ordain that no one whatsoever is forced or coerced to alter this Missal, and that this present document cannot be revoked or modified, but remain always valid and retain its full force." Now, defenders of groups such as the Society of St. Pius X will often cite this section of Quo Primum and argue that it means that any priest can freely celebrate the traditional Latin Mass, and that they need not abide by any restrictions or prohibitions of it. But the problem is that Pius V is talking about a specific Missal here, and it's not the Missal that is used by groups like the Society of Pius X, or any of the other traditionalist groups other than Sedevacantists as far as I'm aware. For context, after the Council of Trent, there have actually been a total of 6 Roman Missals that have been promulgated by the Church prior to the start of the Second Vatican Council. In 1570, Pius V promulgated the Missal along with the Pro Primum. But then you had the 1604 Missal under Clement VIII, the 1634 Missal under Urban VIII, the 1884 Missal under Leo XIII, the 1920 Missal under Benedict XV, and finally the 1962 Missal under John XXIII, which is the Missal used by most traditionalists today, including the Society of Pius X. So if you're gonna take Quo Primum at face value, it's not the 1962 Missal that cannot be suppressed or changed, it's only the 1570 Missal. But even with that, there's a problem with the fact that Pius V himself changed the Missal 1 year later when he added the Feast of Our Lady of Victory. So it seems clear to me that when Pius V said that the Quo Primum would always remain valid and retain its full force, he clearly was not saying that the Holy See could never revise the liturgy, but rather that the whole Church must universally obey the directives of the Holy See with regard to the liturgy. Now, some argue that what Pius V was expressing was not that the Missal cannot be changed at all, but rather that the Mass must remain basically or essentially the same, and not drastically overhauled the way it was after Vatican II. So basically, you can trim around the edges of the Mass, but if you change too much, then at some point it becomes a new Mass. But I do want to quibble with this point for just a moment, because in a very strict sense, every Mass is essentially the same. The essence of something is that which makes the thing to be the thing that it is. And so every valid Mass, no matter the rite of the liturgy, they are all essentially the same, because otherwise they would not actually be the Mass. So the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo, and even Eastern liturgies like the Byzantine Rite or the Syro-Malabar Rite, they are all essentially the same because there is only one Mass. It is the crucifixion of Jesus on the cross perpetuated through all time and space for the forgiveness of our sins. So the essence of the traditional Latin Mass is not that it's traditional or that it's Latin, it's the Mass, and it shares that essence with every other valid Mass, regardless of the particular liturgy that surrounds it. I think Dr. Taylor Marshall actually had a great analogy here, because he said that the Mass is like a diamond, and the liturgy is like the ring setting that holds the diamond. And you can make the preciousness of the diamond more beautiful and more obvious by putting it in a beautiful setting that brings out its splendor. And I think that's very true. And I agree that the traditional Latin liturgy is a far more beautiful setting for the Mass than the Novus Ordo. But I don't think that the evidence actually suggests that the Pope doesn't have absolute authority to dictate which liturgies are to be authorized and which should be prohibited. In fact, Venerable Pius XII, in his encyclical Mediator Dei, said this explicitly. He said, quote, "The sovereign pontiff alone enjoys the right to recognize and establish any practice touching the worship of God, to introduce and approve new rites, as also to modify those he judges to require modification." Now, I've also heard the argument that the Pope can't ban the traditional Latin Mass because we only have to submit and obey the Pope when he speaks infallibly. And because a disciplinary action from the Pope is not infallible, it doesn't actually have to be obeyed. In fact, Pope Francis has never made an infallible statement. And while it's true that Pope Francis has never made an infallible statement, the idea that we only have to submit in matters of faith and morals is actually a heresy condemned by the First Vatican Council. In Chapter 3 of Pastor Aeternus, on the power and nature of the primacy of the Roman Pontiff, it states, quote, "All of whatever right and dignity, both pastors and faithful, both individually and collectively, are bound by their duty of hierarchical subordination and true obedience to submit not only in matters which belong to faith and morals, but also in those that appertain to the discipline and government of the Church throughout the world. This is the teaching of Catholic truth, from which no one can deviate without loss of faith and of salvation." And the chapter concludes by saying, "If anyone then shall say that the Roman Pontiff has the office merely of inspection or direction, and not the full and supreme power of jurisdiction over the universal Church, not only in things which belong to faith and morals, but also in those which relate to the discipline and government of the Church spread throughout the world, or assert that he possesses merely the principal part and not all the fullness of this supreme power, or that this power which he enjoys is not ordinary and immediate, both over each and all of the churches, and over each and all of the pastors, and the faithful, let him be anathema." So as far as the question of, can the Pope actually ban the traditional Latin Mass, I can't honestly come to any conclusion other than to say, yes, he can, based on the fact that we know that the Pope can ban the Mass generally, based on the fact that Quo Primum was clearly not intended to state that the Mass can never be revised or changed, based on the fact that Vatican I dogmatically defined the Pope as having the full, immediate, and total authority over the discipline and governance of the entire Church, based on Pius XII's further clarification that the Pope alone has final authority over all the matters touching the worship of God. I honestly can't conclude anything other than the fact that the Pope does have the authority to restrict or even to prohibit the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass. And I take no glee in saying this. I've been very open about the fact that I think that the traditional Latin Mass is better, is more beautiful, is a more fitting setting for the celebration of the Holy Sacrifice in the Mass than the Novus Ordo. I have real criticisms of the Novus Ordo, but I also know that the rubrics of the Mass, the specifics of the liturgy, they're not up to me. They are up to the Church, the hierarchy of the Church, the Vicar of Christ. And it falls to me to submit and obey the authorities of the Church. Because at the end of the day, if I am only obedient to those commands that I want to follow, that I agree with, that I like, then my obedience means nothing. And the Novus Ordo might not be my preference, but the Novus Ordo still has Jesus. And at the end of the day, I don't go to Mass for me. I go to Mass because that's where Jesus is. And so when the Church says that I have to go to the Novus Ordo to see Jesus, then that's what I'm going to do. It is not good to be rebellious. Obedience matters. So let's be sheep and trust in the Lord. Well, with that, I hope that you appreciated this video. I hope it was informative and helpful for you. If it was, be sure to like, comment, do whatever it is the people of the internet do. And if you want to support my ministry more, you can always go to Patreon in the link in the description and get early access to all of my videos and help me to make videos more often. Thank you so much, and God bless you all.